Hello, and welcome to Monnet Conversations, where we address the big global issues from the standpoint of Europe. I'm Anthony Elliott. Work in the time of coronavirus. Everything surrounding the life of jobs, companies, and enterprise has been seemingly turned upside down. In a remarkably short space of time, COVID-19 has unleashed gripping fears, uncertainties and risks the world over, which is now testing social cohesion and globalization right to its very core. People today are working as never before, working from home, doing Zoom meetings online, and much, much more. To make sense of these changes, I recently caught up with Bo-Magnus Salenius, co-founder of TalentMiles, a company using exploration-driven approaches to leadership and professional learning in Finland. And Ralf Blomqvist, partner at main Dialog, a consulting and communication agency in Sweden. Bo, I'm going to start with you first if I can. I'd like to get a sense of what you're witnessing on the ground in Finland in terms of your engagement with companies, industry and enterprise. What challenges are the most pressing that you see at the moment as a result of coronavirus?
First, it's very good to realize that we actually been sitting in isolation, or whatever you want to call this, in lockdown, more or less. And companies do for I think 7 or 8 weeks in Finland now, at least 7 weeks. So things have actually happened and developed during that time. So I think it's it's actually interesting to try to figure out what is going on right now, much more than what did go on for the first 2 or 3 weeks, when things were more or less. Companies were looking for ways to just sort of organize things. But it's very interesting to see what is still going on, and what new things have, and what things haven't sort of occurred. And if what things that still go on is overlong Zoom and Skype and Teams sessions each day. Staff being overloaded and management being overloaded with firefighting and trying to work out how to address pressing issues. Having said this, there's clearly 2 types of companies. My company works with predominantly, it appears, with companies who I mean, it's not business as usual, but it's very much like that. So they are still, that would be industrial companies who are sort of slaving away and working in the background anyway. The things that they do differently now is that they don't travel anywhere. Nobody travels anywhere, but it quite frankly, that's not new.
I'm going to come to you in a moment, Ralf, but I just want to follow up on that, Bo, and ask, have you been surprised at the ease or otherwise with which companies and organizations have responded quickly to these challenges from COVID-19?
Yes, and no, but I would say more no than anything else. I think that real companies who are resilient and have been there for hundreds of years already, or maybe 100 years or several decades, they've seen a thing or two. I mean, most notably the situation in 2008, when for many companies the business just went away over in the period of a couple of weeks, at least, and stopped. Basically, and so it was far from being only financial companies who had that. So they have been there. I think it's more on the individual part, of the individuals in the companies who haven't experienced things like this, but the company structures seem resilient.
That's against a backdrop of lockdown in Finland. It's a very different situation in Sweden, Ralf Blomqvist.
Well, it is, Anthony. I mean, Sweden as a society has, as you probably know by now, tried to keep sort of society open and running as normal as possible, to the extent that can be done. Quintessentially a Swedish idea that the government trusts their citizens and have faith in that the people will obey to sort of recommendations without having to set strict rules and regulations and restrictions. I think that to some extent reflects in the way that the workplace is now sort of function in Sweden. But of course, we see a lot of the same things that we do in Finland as well. I mean, a lot of people, particularly large organizations, are now working remotely, I think for the first time ever. But then again, just going down to sort of the street level, I mean, if I look at our little company, I mean, our headquarters, our office in Gothenburg more or less works, normally. People can go there if they want to, and a lot of people actually do. They send their kids to school and then they head off to the office for 8 or 10 hours or whatever is feasible, and then they go for a beer should they want to do that, and then they head home. So on the micro level, a lot of people still lead a life that they at least try to sort of make sense of as being as normal as possible. But of course, on a grander scale, remote work is a big issue in Sweden as well. And of course, all the implications that Bo mentions of, spending 8 hours in Zoom or Teams or whatever digital means, it does affect you, and it does affect the way that work is done. But it is to some extent a different story.
So faced with those challenges, the way companies and industry in Sweden have responded, sounds like you're saying much the same as in other European countries. You've got a shift of core activities now increasingly into cyberspace. We've seen this the world over, not only offices, but schools, universities, and other work centres have gone from face-to-face interaction across to digital interaction. But I'm just curious, in the context of Sweden, which hasn't faced the same kind of lockdown, has that been jarring for people to be, on the one hand, to be doing more in the digital space, and yet to see things happening in everyday society to some extent continue onwards?
I mean, when I compare Sweden and Finland, I think Swedes do lead a more relaxed sort of day-to-day life compared to what a lot of Finns do currently. But then again, of course, there are other connotations to having an open society that can all be read in the statistics as to what happens. But nevertheless, I think the whole debate about what is allowed and what is not allowed, that hasn't been as significant in Sweden. Because sort of and I think the government and to some extent the companies that we worked with as well have been quite sort of clear on the issue that whatever measures we apply now, we need to apply measures that we sort of can maintain and live with for a longer period of time. So I think the whole narrative of not having sort of to close down the society and then sort of slowly open it up and waiting for a second wave and all that. We haven't had some parts of that discussion in Sweden in the way that we're having it right now in the rest of Europe. And I do believe that affects people to some extent.
So working from home or remote working, it's been said by many companies and organizations, look, it's simply not possible, or at least it's not feasible to do this at a larger scale. COVID-19 seems to have, really brushed away a lot of those worries for many companies. As you're saying, they've simply got on with the act and they're now kind of doing this. I've seen very recently Google made an announcement that it's going to let its employees work from home until the end of 2020. What struck me as interesting there was the use of the term "will let" employees do this until the end of 2020. Bo-Magnus, how do companies develop leadership examples that don't smack of paternalism or of talking down to employees, of saying what we will let you do and what we won't let you do?
Well, great question. But I want to back up a little bit there first, because I think there's something very interesting happening also, which gets a few sort of fewer mentions in LinkedIn and any other places where company people let off steam by writing their blogs and stuff, and that is the fact that companies. I think it's very important to look at there are different realities in different companies. So you have really the ones that I mentioned before, which are the sort of backbone, the ones that are running their process almost seemingly as if nothing had happened. It's not really true, of course, but it, compared to many others, compared to a restaurant, for instance, it's worlds apart. They can't understand each other's realities. I'm quite sure about that. So in those companies, what has happened over just the course of the last weeks now, it has become very clear to HR people, which I talk to mostly, because these HR directors and many others have been sitting at home too, isolated at home and working from home too. It has become very clear to them that this is not the way to work in the future. So we will not see, it will be very interesting to see what Google will actually do in terms of developing new formats for online meetings, because it's quite clear that these formats we have now do not work. So that I'm from a professional point of view, and also of course one of those that are feeling the pain every day of going through the endless sets of meetings, like most of us here on the talk. I think it will be quite interesting to see what new responses will be there, because what we have learned the hard way now is not only that it is the shortcomings of the medium of online platforms when it comes to the dialogue, and there are obvious ones without going into these now, but there are much more how should I say realistic ones, which actually are very down to the basic, just the basic notion of ergonomics. So the fact that people's homes are not equipped with the stuff needed, with the furniture needed, with the broadbands in many cases needed, and so on and so forth. The broadband is easy, but I know for a fact that in a number of companies they are already discussing how they will actually support people getting the right ergonomics, the right chairs, the right tables and stuff for continue working from home. And also the fact that people do not want to work like this. They simply do not like being forced to have meetings back to back for the whole day. So we need to address those issues, and actually the one that you mentioned, the one about the leaders. I think compared to these issues, that's actually a first world type of problem, and it's real. It's real because we all know that the bigger companies, the bigger the company gets, the more the notion, the interest to control employees sort of seems to thrive. So it's quite, talking down is true. But in some the systems are sort of part of that talking down. But so is also, I must just note the fact that so many people have said to me when I have inquired in the international calls and also in Finland over the past weeks. So what's changed? And what's quite clear is we talk differently. We talk about individuals, we talk about people much more than we did before, which goes a little bit contrary to that idea of talking down and being into that traditional managerial idea.
Yeah. So I want to come to the question of control and surveillance. We'll come to those a little bit later. I just want to stick, though, with what you're sketching in there. Are you saying then that, in your view, these current difficulties that beset remote working are those to do with the platforms? They're to do with digitalization. It's not to do with the shift from working in the office across to working at home? Or do you think the problems runs deeper than that?
Very good question. I suppose this is your line of work, Anthony, but I think that I think they run deeper, and I think we haven't just noticed that before, because we have been talking about digitalization and the new way of working on a sort of idealistic way, or and the other extreme, a totally sort of a negative way. So what we haven't really understood what it means. Now we do, and now there's plenty to analyze.
So work shifts from the office to home. Ralf Blomqvist, what happens to home once you continue to work at home over, once you get past the first few weeks of this experiment? Is home still home?
That's a really good question, Anthony. When we talk to people now and see what is actually going on in homes, I just want to echo Bo's opinions on the fact that probably not a big surprise, but our homes weren't really designed for this kind of life, when you have in many cases 2 adults and a bunch of children working from home and going to school. And this has to do with, basic IT infrastructure, having enough gadgets, having enough bandwidth, but also having a secure space where you can actually close the door and do something else. And I'm sure we'll talk more about open office environments and office landscape later on. I think the same sort of challenges can be applied to homes as well. I'd like to go back to one point, which is sort of the whole notion of that our sort of digital means that we have now, be it whatever office software suite you prefer to use, that they're not sort of functioning in the way that they should be in these times. There's also another thing that we see with customers and consumers now, and that is that a lot of people are really leading a truly digital life for the first time ever, which means that they are doing things that they've never done on a grand scale. For instance, sitting in Zoom or Teams meeting for continually day after day after day, ordering food on the internet, visiting your doctor with a sort of in a remote session. So a lot of these things are sort of firsts for a vast number of people out there, and I think that will sort of also have its implications on how we choose to lead our professional lives in the future, right? Despite and acknowledging both points that this is not first of all, it's not a fun way to work. You do want to catch up with people, and you do miss the lunch discussions or the coffee room chit chat or whatever. Quite a few people have got accustomed to the fact that it could actually be a nice way to lead your life, to stay away from the office or stay away from the workplace for at least a couple of days a week. And I know some of the clients that we have, particularly large organizations, are now struggling with how do we set up sort of work routines and managerial routines to make sure that whenever we need people to be there, they will actually be at the office or be wherever they're supposed to be. So I assume we'll be through a period, quite a chaotic period before we probably settle on some sort of hybrid form of work where digital and physical and being at the office or working from home will sort of intertwine in a neat and pragmatic way.
Very interesting that you say, for the first time perhaps ever, leading these new digital lives. I wonder whether also, in a sense, leading a kind of globalized life to complement that. It's been argued by some critics that this crisis is a turning point in history because we're seeing a collapse of globalization. The arguments to do with the disintegrating power of global supply chains, for example. But if we bear in mind that globalization is not just economic, that globalization is also fundamentally to do with culture and to do with communication, I think what you're underscoring, Ralf, here for our attention is leading these digital lives means an extension. It means a kind of radicalization of globalization. Do you think that's going too far?
No, and I think it's not either or. And talking about globalization certainly isn't my home turf. But I mean, it would be. I think it's a lazy analysis to just shrug this off and say that globalization is dead. There's much more to sort of looking at how, as I said, how people lead their life has a lot of things to tell us now about what will actually happen, and the whole notion of sort of, I mean, companies are fairly skilled at sort of reorganizing and recalibrating their work processes or their supply chains or whatever it may be. So I'm sure things will change by way of how we perceive globalization to that extent. But I mean, the notion that people would fundamentally choose to live a fundamentally different life just due to COVID-19, I don't think we'll see that happen. People will try to find and will find ways to work around all this.
Restaurants were mentioned before, and I bring them up again because from one angle, they've been the hardest hit businesses in the pandemic. And yet, in order to survive, they have had to really radicalize their activities in order to stay in business itself. So that's include, measures such as minimizing human contact through digital ordering and payment and takeaway and so on and so forth. In the way that restaurants have really radicalized the very basis of their activity, as well as the planning that good restaurants are currently doing in order to stay alive and thrive in the post-COVID-19 world, I wonder what leaders of companies, leaders of organizations, I mean, how do we ditch the dogma and actually embrace the moment to engage in new thoughts, in new thinking? Bo, you work with leaders, you work with heads of organizations across Europe. What's your sense of this? Is there a real reckoning here, a new reckoning, an embracement of change?
I think we're starting to see that. We start to see that. Sorry, it's certainly not very. Many companies are still busy with very everyday type of things, but the companies and we've looked a lot at this because there seems to be two ways of leading and two types of leadership that are actually of which one is much better to support what you just said. The companies now who have realized that it is almost impossible to control their staff at this moment. In other words, the companies who have understood that where innovation or where the new actually happens is at the front line, where people take for instance schools or so actually the teachers doing the teaching who now understand what works and what doesn't. If you have a leader and in a municipality or in a school system that insists on still being the type of manager who goes in and starts every morning and this and that, instead of taking the back seat and making sure that the people that are in the front line, the people actually doing the work, and that includes many middle managers too. So it's not only service people, but ensuring that these people have the forums to reflect, ask the questions, then that are actually driving the innovation, and reflection. If the managers do this, then they start to see interesting things. This is the report we are getting. And then there are a number of companies where leaders are and staff alike are really struggling because they are trying desperately to fulfill the same protocols that they had before, the same Monday meetings, the same this and that and whatever. It was actually a fantastic quote from a person working at Apple that I heard just a couple of weeks ago, who said that he has learned that what the leadership approach for this era we see now, for the situation we see now, is articulate some sort of vision, then just trust the people more than you've done ever before. That was his take, and he's not in the middle ranks of Apple, and that came really straight from the heart, I would say.
Very interesting that schedules, by the sound of it, might be the undoing of our new ways of working. It sounds as if our inherited ways of doing things, and our attachment to those inherited ways of doing things are simply not going to be fit for purpose in this new context. I want to shift, if I can, from the focus on organizations, companies, and enterprises across now to individuals, the employees, and the life of women and men, the lives of women and men as they seek to grapple with these changes. If we go back to remote working and think about the experience of working from home, it's been interesting, but there are now some results coming in showing that productivity has actually not dipped, that we're seeing certain rises in productivity from different companies, obviously in different sectors of the market. One thing that caught my eye was, according to a recent Gallup poll in the United States, over 60% of American workers have indicated that they prefer to work remotely as much as possible, and intriguingly, that they want to do that even when the public health restrictions are lifted. Ralf, what's your response to that? Do you think people are just getting a bit too carried away in this? Because, we're still, historically speaking, in relatively early stages of a global pandemic.
Yep. Well, you might, for a good reason, argue that question was posed sort of during the honeymoon period of remote work. I mean, I think we're now at some sort of or past an intersection where during the first probably couple of weeks we had these eureka moments when people all of a sudden realized that you actually get a lot more done by spending hours and hours on video conferences, and you can skip out on unnecessary meetings and coffee room chit chat or whatever that might be. But I think that sort of eureka moment sort of is now fading away, and we're more sort of in a hangover mood when we all of a sudden realize that 8 hours of remote work isn't really a great way to spend a workday unless we have something else. So I think that's probably part of it, but I don't think there's any turning back, and I sort of, you have to smile at the Google quote that you mentioned, that at least even a sort of a company like Google, who presumably are at the forefront by way of not only how work is done, but predominantly how digital work is done, apparently still have the idea that they can allow people to do things like this, or they can sort of on a corporate level make decisions that remote work isn't something that we should be doing. I think there's no turning back in that sense, because as stated previously, a lot of people on a grand scale have now tried new ways of work, and not only work, but also new ways of leading their lives, where sort of digital sort of interactions are now sort of part and parcel of everyday life and what goes on in our homes. And I think that's already happened on such a grand scale, so there's no going back. But then again, I do echo Bo's opinions. I'm not sure that everyone would like to lead a life like this in the long run. I guess we'll probably settle for some sort of more nuanced ways of balancing work as we knew it, sort of spirit we knew it. If I may continue on that notion, because I think it's not only about work, it's also about what happens outside work. And people, a lot of people seem to have a lot of time these days to do whatever they want to do. And I suppose it's not a surprise, but to my knowledge, I think we talk way too little about this. For instance, the fact that there's no sports on television. So if you're, I mean, a lot of people in Sweden and Finland are, they're very much into sports. So you would have, right now you would have the Ice Hockey World Championships running. You would have, the final games of the Premier League season in football in the UK and all sorts of things. So even an averagely interested individual would be bombarded with news on sports, with live coverage of games and whatnot. And now that you've taken that out of people's day-to-day life, all of a sudden a sort of hardcore Premier League enthusiast like yours truly all of a sudden has 10 more hours per week of doing something else. And that doesn't, I think that to some extent has implications on how we want to lead our lives and where we want to work and what we want to do as well. So it's all intertwined.
That's a fascinating insight. Can I just press you one step further with that? With this, as it were, this emptying out of areas of interest, this emptying out of areas of fascination. I mean, if, as you say, a sports enthusiast can suddenly find that they've, basically 10 to 15 hours per week of their devotional time to sport has been emptied out, and now they've got to fill in that gap. What do you think that might do to individuals, that increased awareness of how we fill up and also how we decrease the time with which we can fill up our minds, our areas of activity, and actually what is in effect our own self-identity?
That's a really good question and a big one to address. But I think what we can do is reflect on what people are doing. And I think fascinating enough, despite the fact that people spend more and more time together in their homes, both in Sweden and Finland, I know some families who actually have to schedule their time together because somebody is always somewhere else. So now that you can work remotely and schedule a Zoom meeting any time of the day, as long as somebody is awake, and in a global world, somebody will be. One of the kids will always, be playing an online game together with his friends at a certain moment in time. So actually together, to sort of have dinner together, you actually need to schedule the dinner. So I think to some extent home life is more and more resembling professional lives now, that you actually have to apply the same means and the same methods to sort of enable interaction even within the confines of the family. So I think that's kind of interesting. Another thing is, of course, what do people do instead if you can't do sports, if all your kids, training sessions are cancelled due to the fact that you can't congregate? What do you do instead? Of course, I see now a lot of people on social media, in people that haven't been there before to the extent that they apparently have. I see a lot of lists on people being urgently having to tell everybody else about, their top 10 favorite records from, the 70s hard rock era, or the 10 books that influenced my life the most. So sort of the need to continually sort of tell people who you are and to show them your preferences or communicate your identity or whatever that might be, given the fact that we can't do it face to face, where it seems that we're looking for new means to do that.
At the level of the individual, of course, offices will not necessarily just completely disappear, but they're going to look different in the future. There's already a lot of speculation about the end of open floor plan designing. and a reintroduction of cubicles or other sorts of partitions now for health reasons. This does seem to be this does seem to be something, understandably, that worries people, the thought of returning to work and returning to open plan offices. Bo, what do you see as the likely future of the office and how the office will look and how we will engage with others at offices?
Well, I'm going to take that question, Anthony, as in what I personally envisage, and not so much about what we hear from different places now at the moment. Strikes me when I hear my friend Ralf describing the realities there, and to a certain extent, I think we have different realities, because there are life in working life right now is also extremely busy. So people are doing a hell of a lot of work, and in many quarters. I mean, we're talking about so in many companies, having 10 hours a week to do something with is not happening. So, but I think both are true. So that's it. But back to the question about the offices, is that if it's been, I've been thinking a lot about this since we have overnight, it seems, we have turned our homes into offices, in our home into work. So just really slightly naively and tongue-in-cheek, my question, and I actually put this to my son the other day, and said, so what will actually, where will we go for if we are at work now, where should we go from here to be not at work? What would that be? And my thinking there, Anthony, is that place will actually be the office. The office in the future, I hope, and I wouldn't be surprised actually if it will be a place where we will actually get to meet up. It will be a place for meeting up, a place for sitting down in different settings, perhaps with the famous 2 meter of distance, having long sofas. I'm really starting to go at it now, as you can see. But really having very, very versatile environments in which you can sit and do. Though the type of environment that companies with a lot of money today, we all know we have all been to big offices and big companies, and one wonders sometimes if anybody actually uses those facilities when you work, when you walk around in an office. Perhaps we will see offices where we actually will use the sofas and the chairs where we for good dialogue. Again, I'm quite sure this will not be all of it, but I think there's something to it that we will need to find ways of meeting up again, and not just to exchange chit chat, but to have really empathetic dialogues.
If the home has been turned into an office and almost overnight, as you say, does that then mean that we do now need to get used to our homes being increasingly monitored by our employers? You mentioned this earlier, Bo, when you raised the issue of control and surveillance. Employers are increasingly monitoring their employees' productivity now. There are ways, obviously, in terms of digital measurement, digital tracking, how often an employee and the speed with which an employee responds to queries and issues arising. What's your current thoughts about that and the kind of panic that it seems to generate in many?
Yes, I think it should create a panic in many, and I'm looking at it very, very worriedly, because there is I think there's a big how should I say interest to take that route from a shareholder value kind of thinking. and a short-sighted sort of value creation type of approach, whereas the innovation type of approach and leadership approach would require more of the trust. So I think both have been mentioned, what you just said, and if you remember a while back when I raised the trust issue, so there are companies now exceedingly, you see companies belonging to one or the other camp. The ones who go for the trust are the ones who go for the more the control. No way of knowing what will happen. Finland, thankfully, so far, there's little evidence that we would be heading down the more control type of route. That is not the type, and it's also not the type of the. Finland has a tradition and a culture of self-control much more than having others control.
I'd like to finish up with what may seem like a trivial question, but I suspect it's not. And that's what impact COVID-19 might have on dress codes and the dress code of the office environment. Of course, offices, certainly throughout the rich North over the last decade or so, have become, for many, an increasingly casual affair. But in the time of coronavirus, and as we look to eventually come out of coronavirus into the sort of post-COVID-19 territory, effectively many workers are going to go from many weeks of working in pajamas or sweatpants and then back to office clothes again. Ralf, how do you see this playing out?
Well, Anthony, just by looking at how people look these days when you see them on certainly to some extent blurry screens, but apparently there has been some major changes in how people dress up or rather not dress up for work just during just a few weeks. So it will certainly be interesting to see whether we go back to the way that we used to look. Also, what I noted during the early days of remote work, there were a lot of what I with a big smile on my face called remote work tailorists, who told everybody else how you're supposed to look and how you're supposed to lead your day. Get up and have a good breakfast and make sure to get some fresh air before you commence, and then you dress up just as if you would go to work. And at least for what I see, very few people actually do that. So we do look different, and what I also think is that people apparently have become more interested in how people look. I mean, I've seen remote conferences where everybody brings a dog or a cat or a kid or whatever, just to give other people a glimpse of what their private lives look like. So it might be that our corporate selves and our private selves, sort of the boundaries are blurring between those two, but I don't know, the jury's still out.
A final word to you, Bo, on this.
I'm with Ralf in much of this. I do see, I mean, corporate discussions over online, still you can still see the corporate touch there. There's still the occasional jacket there, and so on and so forth. I for one, I think that just doing the math actually about how much I think an average businessman invests in 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 suits a year. So really, if you're not going to need those, and you still can you can look sharp, and you can look driving, and you can look for far less. And what I want to drive at actually is that I for one wouldn't mind if this is where we would start to become a bit more sustainable, and I wouldn't be surprised if this could be a place where people say that, look, the new chic is using clothes much smarter than we do. have done before in working life.
Bo-Magnus Salenius, Ralf Blomqvist, thanks very much for joining us on Monnet Conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.